Beyond the Hidden Chapter. Tonight's story begins with a letter that arrived 20 years too late. The rain started the morning the letter came, and I remember thinking that was strange, because the forecast had promised sun. I was standing in my grandfather's kitchen, drinking coffee from a chipped mug he'd owned longer than I'd been alive, when the mail slot rattled. One envelope. Yellowed. Soft at the corners the way paper gets when it has been somewhere damp for a very long time. The ink had bled, but the name was clear. Arthur Hale, my grandfather, the man who had been dead for 18 years. I turned it over in my hands. There was no return address, only a postmark, smudged but legible, and when I read the date my coffee went cold in my throat. The letter had been mailed 20 years ago. It should have arrived 2 years before he died. It had taken 20 years to travel 4 miles across town, and the handwriting on the front was a woman's. I want to tell you I set it down. That I called the post office, filed a report, did the sensible thing. But you already know I didn't, because you're still here. So let me tell you what was inside. The paper inside was thinner than the envelope, folded 3 times, and as I opened it, a faint smell rose off it. Lavender, old and ghostly. The handwriting was rushed, slanting downhill as it went, the way people write when their hand is shaking. Mr. Hale, it began. I don't know who else to trust. You said if I was ever afraid I should come to you. I'm afraid now. Someone has been following me. 3 weeks. A gray car with no front plate. He waits outside the diner. He knows when I finish my shift. Last night he was outside my window, and when I turned on the light he didn't run. He just stood there, smiling. The police think I'm imagining it. My mother thinks I want attention. But you believed me about the other thing, and I think the other thing is why this is happening. Please. I'll come Sunday. If I don't, something has gone wrong. You know what to do with what I gave you. Emily. I read it 4 times. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, because my legs had stopped agreeing to hold me. I didn't know an Emily. My grandfather had never mentioned one, but the letter spoke to him like he was a lighthouse she'd been steering toward her whole life. That night I searched her name and the name of our town, and the first result stopped my breath. Emily Cross, 19, vanished without a trace. 20 years ago. 3 days after the date on the letter. She had finished her shift at a roadside diner, stepped out into the dark, and was never seen again. No body, no car, no suspect. The case had gone cold within a year. There was a photograph. A girl with a tired smile and kind eyes, the kind of face you'd trust to carry your secrets. She had written to my grandfather for help, and the help never came because the letter never arrived. I told myself it was a coincidence that the house had stayed in the family, that I'd inherited it only because I was the last one left who wanted it. But the next morning I went up to the attic, and I understood that nothing in this story was a coincidence at all. Because my grandfather had a room up there I had never been allowed to enter as a child. The door had always been locked. The key had died with him, or so I'd thought. But the lock was old, and a screwdriver and 20 patient minutes were enough. Inside, the walls were covered in paper, newspaper clippings, maps, photographs connected by faded string, a timeline, hand-drawn, running the length of one wall, and at the center, pinned above everything else like the sun in a solar system, was that same tired smile. Emily. My grandfather hadn't just known her. He had spent the rest of his life looking for her. I stood in that room for a long time. There were boxes, dozens of them, each one labeled in his careful handwriting. Witness statements he'd copied by hand. A logbook of license plates. A list of names, some of them crossed out, some circled twice. And folders, so many folders, each one a person in this town who had told him something, and then, the notes said, changed their story. The diner cook who first told police he'd seen a gray car, then swore weeks later he'd seen nothing. The night clerk at the motel by the highway who reported a man paying cash for a room he never slept in, then quit and left town. A retired sheriff's deputy whose name appeared again and again, always circled, always with the same 3 words beside it. He knows more. My grandfather had been building a case, quietly, for 16 years, alone. And then I found the part that made my hands go cold all over again. In the bottom of one box, beneath everything else, was a smaller envelope. Inside it, a single photograph. Emily, much younger, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting on a porch I recognized instantly. Because I was sitting beneath the same porch roof right now. She had been photographed on my grandfather's steps. On the back, in his handwriting, 2 words. A date and a name I had never heard him say. My girl. I sat down on the dusty floor of that attic, and I felt the entire shape of my family tilt sideways. I'd been told my grandmother lost a baby long before my mother was born, a daughter, a grief so heavy the family never spoke of it. I had always assumed the child had died. But what if she hadn't died? What if she had been given away? What if Emily Cross was my grandfather's daughter, raised by another family, and the other thing she mentioned in her letter, the thing he had believed her about, was the truth of where she came from? I drove to the town records office the next morning with my heart slamming against my ribs. I told the clerk I was researching family history. She was bored and helpful, a dangerous combination, and within an hour I had Emily Cross's birth certificate in front of me. Mother, Margaret Cross. Father, left blank. But there was an adoption notation, sealed with a case number, and when I cross-referenced that case number against my grandfather's logbook, I found it. He'd written it down. Beside it, in pen pressed so hard it tore the page. They took her twice. Once as a baby, once for good. I will not stop. Emily was his daughter. The daughter everyone believed had died at birth. Given to the Cross family in a private arrangement that someone powerful had wanted buried. My grandfather had found her when she was grown, had quietly become part of her life, had been the one adult who believed her when she said she was being followed. And 3 days after she wrote to him for help, she was gone. The letter never reached him. So he never knew, in those crucial first days, that she'd been afraid. By the time he understood she was missing, the trail was cold, and the people responsible had already begun rewriting the story. I should have stopped there. I had an answer. But every answer in this thing opened a deeper door, and I couldn't stop pulling them. Because the question that wouldn't leave me alone was the simplest one of all. Why now? Why had the letter taken 20 years to cross 4 miles of town? The postmark told me where it had been mailed. A small post office on the east side, the kind of place that had closed years ago. I went there anyway. The building was a laundromat now, but 2 doors down was a hardware store, and behind the counter was a man old enough to remember. I showed him the envelope. His face changed. "Where did you get that?" he said. Not a question, a fear. I told him it had arrived in my mailbox. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he told me something that turned the whole story inside out. "Letters that went missing back then," he said slowly. "A lot of them went missing on purpose. There was a postal carrier. Route covered the east side and the hill where the big houses are. He'd pull mail, for certain people, anything that might cause trouble for the families up on that hill. He held it, burned most of it. He swallowed. But not all. Some he kept. I always wondered why a man would keep the evidence of his own sin. The carrier's name, he told me, was Del Murphy, and Del Murphy had died 3 weeks ago. That was when it began to make sense. The timing. The reason the letter had finally come. I found Del Murphy's house through the obituary. His granddaughter was clearing it out, a tired woman my own age surrounded by garbage bags and decades of a stranger's life. When I told her why I'd come, she didn't look surprised. She looked relieved, the way people look when a weight they didn't choose is finally lifted off them. "There's a trunk," she said, "in the basement. He told me before he died. He said when he was gone I should mail what was inside. No notes, no names, just put them in the post and let them go where they were always supposed to go." She wiped her eyes. I thought he was confused. I mailed maybe a dozen of them last month. Old letters. I didn't read them. I didn't want to know. A dying man's confession, paid out 1 stamp at a time, 20 years too late. That is why the letter arrived now. Not fate. Not the universe correcting itself. Just an old man who had stolen Emily's cry for help, carried the guilt of it for 2 decades, and lacked the courage to confess until he was safely beyond punishment. He had mailed his sins from beyond the grave and made his granddaughter the messenger. I thought that was the end of it. The terrible, human, ordinary end of it. I was wrong. Because the granddaughter said one more thing as I was leaving. She said her grandfather hadn't worked alone. That toward the end, in his confused nights, he'd talk to someone who wasn't there. Apologize to him. Beg him to understand that he'd only done what he was told. He kept saying a name, she told me. Over and over. He'd say, "I'm sorry, Arthur. I'm so sorry, Arthur. You trusted me and I let her die." Arthur, my grandfather. Del Murphy hadn't just intercepted Emily's letter by chance on his route. He had known my grandfather. They had been friends. And the letter he'd buried was a letter from my grandfather's own daughter, begging my grandfather for help, stolen by the one man my grandfather would have trusted to deliver it. The people on the hill hadn't needed a stranger to silence Emily. They'd used the one person close enough to my grandfather to know exactly which letters mattered. I went back to the attic that night, and I read every page my grandfather had ever written about the case, and now I read them differently, because he had never known. 16 years of investigating, and he had died believing the letter simply never existed, that Emily had run out of time before she could reach him. He never knew she had reached out. He never knew his oldest friend had held her last words in his hands and chosen the hill over the child. If the letter had come on time, he could have saved her. That was the wound he'd carried without ever knowing its true shape. And then, at the very bottom of the last box, I found the thing that broke me. A letter. Sealed. Addressed in my grandfather's hand. To me. He'd written it the year before he died. He must have left it for whoever finally inherited the house, knowing the search would pull them upstairs eventually. Knowing somehow that the truth was patient and would wait. If you're reading this, it said, then you found her. My Emily. The granddaughter you never knew you had a claim to. The aunt your mother never knew she had. I'm sorry to hand you this weight. But I am an old man, and I'm running out of time, and the people who took her are still up on that hill, and I cannot reach them. Maybe you can. I never found out why the letter she promised me never came. She said she'd write if she was afraid. She never did, or so I believed. I told myself she simply ran out of time. I have spent my life unable to forgive a postman, a road, a stretch of bad luck for the days I lost. If you ever learn the truth of those missing days, learn it for me. And do what I could not. Find her. Bring her home. He had asked his friend Del once whether any of Emily's mail had ever crossed his route. Del had looked him in the eye and said no. I sat in that attic until the sun came up, holding 2 letters across 20 years. One from a frightened girl. One from the father who never got to read her fear in time. Both of them delivered to me, the last one left, decades after the people who wrote them had gone silent. I have taken everything to the state police now. Not the local ones. My grandfather's notes taught me which names not to trust. The gray car, the deputy, the families on the hill whose money had bought a postman's loyalty and a town's forgetting. It is a real case again. After 20 years, people are being asked questions they thought they'd buried with the century. I don't know yet if they'll find her. The hill keeps its secrets, and the men who made them are old now, or dead, sliding past justice the way Del Murphy did. But I know her name now. Emily Cross, my grandfather's daughter. And I know she did not imagine the car, or the man at the window, or the smile. She reached out into the dark for help, and the dark swallowed her words for 20 years. But the letter arrived. Late, impossibly late, carried by a guilty man's deathbed and a tired woman with a roll of stamps. It arrived, and I am going to answer it.